Hi everyone, Dan Gunner from Insane Forensics. Welcome back to Tech Talk Tuesday, where every week we try to give something to help your threat hunting and security program. And today what we're going to dive into is a technique called living off the land. We're going to talk about how you can find it, whether you're doing incident response or threat hunting, so whether you're on that proactive and reactive side. And why we're going to talk through this is a few days ago, as of the recording of this video, on November 9th, Mandiant released a report about a breach into Ukraine's power grid that happened late last year. We'll talk about the dates, we'll talk about what it was, but what the Russian military, who is generally known to be associated with this group, both through Department of Justice indictments, through other threat intel sources. What this group did is they used what's called living on the land techniques to breach through. So they did certainly use an industrial application, but they also used features that are just built into Windows to do it. So again, this is a technique that works both at the nation state levels between two nation states, as well as you'll actually see this in ransomware groups. You'll see this in other breaches. So it's a really interesting kind of case study to talk through. Let's dive right in. So attack details. So the attack happened in late 2022. Again, the alleged group for this was a group commonly known out as Sandworm. What's interesting with Sandworm is you have these Department of Justice indictments, like this one I think was from October 2020 was the date on it, to where the DOJ said, hey, we know these 6 Russian military officers generally tied to this group. This group's a very active group, right? So they've been targeting Ukraine since at least 2014, notably the 2015 crash override or 2016 crash override attack. 2015, they did a more manual attack on the electrical power grid. They aren't just attacking power generation and power distribution and transmission in Ukraine. They're also tied to attacks on 2017 French presidential campaign, on the Winter Olympic Games in 2018. And so this is a group that, is really focused on quite a lot of political interest for what seems to be, again, the Russian side. Known tools, they have some of their internal tools. So you'll hear about Black Energy, you'll hear about Bad Rabbit, Cyclops Blink, Indestroyer, which was one of the tool sets from Ukraine or from the 2016 attack. If you're Drago's side, they call it Crash Override. If you're some of the other vendors, they call it Indestroyer. Indestroyer 2, which came, I think, a year or two ago through there. Then they have wipers like Killdesk, but they still use tools like Mimikatz and PS.exe, right? So this is a group that, to accomplish their objectives, they're using a mix of both internally developed and external tools. They were indicted by the Department of Justice in October 2020, hence what you see here. And so what's interesting is even the U.S. government is sharing some open information on what they know, about this group, right? But the late 2020 attack sequence, this happened, the intrusion was June 2020, second or before. How we know this is Mandiant in their report. And so again, we're talking through the Mandiant blog they put out. Mandiant was the one doing incident response out here. Mandiant shared that details. So again, we have some high fidelity information from Mandiant that the intrusion happened. At least one intrusion happened June 2022 or June 2022. And then the actual disruptive events were caused on October 10th and 12th, right? So there was some dwell time in there. Again, it's hard to say, was that intrusion in June the one to where they got in, or was that just another intrusion? You never know, right? When you're doing incident response, you're only really acting off the data that both you can collect and process and what you see in there. But again, that's what we know from the Mandiant report. One path into IT that we know about was a web shell called Neo, REGEORG, and then Go-Getter for Tunneler. They installed that on what sounded like a Linux server because they used systemd. They installed it as a service. So that way they were able to drop kind of open web shells, open tunnelers to establish communication from at least the IT side of the organization out. regardless of if the system was rebooted. What Mandiant shared on getting access to the OT environment was that the attackers likely moved through a hypervisor, right? Something like VMware, something hosting virtual machines that was hosting substation SCADA applications, right? This is where we're actually starting to see in the industrial space an interesting move, because more asset owners actually are starting to put, substation applications and even servers like this into virtualization, whether it be through VMware and others. This is a very timely instance to where, at least by Mandiant's account, that OT access was gained through that hypervisor. Once OT access was gained, they used an ISO image to actually execute the industrial application in here. So you see an image on the right, you see that a.iso. They mounted an ISO file. That ISO file had a little Visual Basic script, it had a batch script, and then it had basically a set of commands. This was, that we'll see in a minute, this was the actual commands that got fed into the Scilc.exe, which is part of the microscada application, to actually send out the changes to the programmable logic controller. So SCIL is one method of changing the programming on remote or on RTUs on other embedded devices out there. So again, through this, what we had was an attack where the ISO came in. It was used to call the command line of a legitimate microscada tool and push the changes out there. Then they used Caddy Wiper in the IT environment by Mandiant's account. That was likely used 2 days later to remove forensic artifacts for some disruption and chaos likely in there. But again, from end to end of the attack, this was the picture really that Mandiant drew in there. So when we talk about living on the land binaries or LolBins, I just grabbed a quick example from ChatGPT, which did a really good job kind of getting to that basic level. What LolBins are, living off the land binary and scripts, these are legitimate tools built into the operating system. Things like PowerShell. In this case, it was Visual Basic Script, or using commonly used applications to perform malicious actions while avoiding detection, right? These are trusted ones. It's kind of in that gray space of these are applications you expect to see. So you can't just whitelist them or allow list or deny list them, right? These are applications you see. At the same time, the context of when these applications are used and the behaviors you see when these applications are used, that's definitely something you can detect off. But the challenge here again is with these LolBins, with living off the land binary and script, it's using built-in functionality that's somewhat expected. To the second point here, this makes detection and prevention more challenging because it does seem legitimate at first glance. And so we'll dive into what that looks like. So from Mandiant's report, we talked about that ISO that dropped out that Visual Basic script, passed the command line, that logic to pass on to the RTU for the change. Well, the good thing with living on the land binaries and with scripts is we can still process them. We can still see these with Windows event logs. So 4688, we did actually a whole Tech Talk Tuesday on using Windows process creation event and termination events for threat hunting. This is a case to where even if they're using that script in that application that exists there, if you have this level of logging turned on Windows, we're still going to see both the parent process name, the child process name. We can still dig into a lot of details. Again, this requires some level of logging to be enabled on your endpoint. Not every industrial Windows machine is going to have this level of logging enabled. But when the attacker does use what we saw or what Mandiant showed to be visible on how this industrial application was called, we still see the footprints in that event log. Again, check out the Tech Talk Tuesday. We talked through this log a lot more. I think we talked through in there how to even create the log and do others with it. But one way, again, we can see this because this is harder to see on the network. Again, if we're just looking at the network level, we're going to see the IEC 104, the industrial traffic going to the RTU, to the programmable logic controller to the embedded system. But on the host, again, we actually can get visibility down to the granularity of this. Something that we actually do pull this log in for that reason, to say, hey, let's start looking at the relationships between parent and child processes and the command line and what gets called in here. In the Mandiant example, you can see they called sc program exec scilc.exe, which is expected, and then they called that -do, which is a command with that s1.txt file that comes from that malicious ISO, right? So if you had this event active, you would see that resource from that malicious ISO get called in. We can monitor script execution to find even more. So here we have a PowerShell script. So same deal, right? You can look for this PowerShell calling that scilc.exe from there. If it's in PowerShell, it's also likely going to be in the PowerShell event logs in addition to the event logs related for process if you have that on. So even if you don't have your 4688s on, you might have PowerShell on if it was called the way that they're showing here in the Mandiant report, or it might be in some other area. So again, whole Tech Talk Tuesday on the monitoring, check that out. Other ways to detect it, right? Because not everyone's going to have that event log on. On the host side, parent process analysis, right? So, in this command here, we also see, wscript.shell getting called. We see that that Visual Basic script being called. Visual Basic scripts are a part of a lot of industrial applications. That being said, you can kind of, see what your general Visual Basic scripts are being called out of this, and say, hey, this is a weird script to be called. These are weird parameters to get passed into this. Hey, when this script is generally used, it's used when we're doing this function. And hey, when we're not in turnaround, when we're not in maintenance, when we're not pushing logic, this is unexpected, right? And so again, looking at parent processes, that's a good one for threat hunting. If you're in an incident response case, it's also going to be helpful. If you pull a memory image, right? With memory image, you can say, okay, what is that bound port over to the process? Again, we can see the process hierarchy. We can see the resources being pulled in. And so if you're pulling memory into this, you're getting a view also that, the wire isn't going to see. When we talk about the network, we're unfortunately looking at IEC 104 commands, which are a little harder to dig through, right? You're digging through then the normalization of that traffic, to where on the host, things are actually going to look a little weirder as you're looking through this. File locations and relationships, right? For that parameter, when you're loading that malicious logic file to then call the script to push it out, or to call the legitimate application to put it out, the file location on that update to the industrial device is going to be in a weird folder most likely, or you're going to see a file write into that folder, or a weird resource in a legitimate folder, right? So understanding file locations and relationships. Why bring this up? Some people are like, isn't there a big universe of things you can look at in there? It's somewhat true. At the same time, a lot of the industrial applications work same from plant to plant. Sometimes you have weird temp files and directories, but there's a lot of predictability when you're getting to this granularity on the host level. When you look on the network level, so what's challenging with the SCIL files and how this program is passed, generally what's happening is that logic file is going to be interpreted by the workstation side, who's then going to break it down into the commands that it needs to send to the embedded device, right? And in that case, the interpretation of the file happening on the workstation means, in the case of this in Ukraine, you're going to see a bunch of IEC 104 commands for, uploading the different set points, checking the interrogation command, checking what values are places, setting parameters, starting and stopping actuators, checking your, program counter, both to possibly reset it or get it to the right level. So, because some people do look and say, okay, what's my program counter? Hey, why suddenly was the program counter incremented, right? It's kind of one of those canaries that some people use, right? In this case, though, the IEC 104 commands are what you'll see either in passive network monitoring off the span port. It is going to be a little challenging than what you have, through the host side. Certainly possible to do it. Again, you want to look for unexpected logic updates via those SCL files outside of the operationally expected time, right? Generally in turnaround or when you're doing maintenance, your function codes, what's being used, the operations sent out to that embedded device are likely going to be different than when someone's using this in an off time. So all stuff you can look at as you're going through. Again, the quick overview here was to talk through the Mandiant report that released a few days ago to provide a few new detection ideas based on what Mandiant shared there. Because again, what's interesting here is we have a case to where, living on the land approach that works really well in the IT side, we are seeing it more in the OT side by a sophisticated attacker that's experienced in this area. Again, living off the land's challenging because it blends in with the expected traffic there. But once we get to that deep granularity, once we dig in and really understand when should stuff happen, how do I monitor this? There's a whole lot of opportunity to find even really sophisticated things that impact the grid like this. So thanks again for tuning in this week. We hope this was helpful, and we hope to see you back next week. Thanks a lot.